The wind hit 37 degrees below zero at 0347 hours in the Pancher Valley. Sergeant Sarah Chun watched her breath crystallize into ice particles that hung suspended in the air for a fraction of a second before being ripped away by gusts that could strip exposed skin raw in under 4 minutes. She was kneeling in snow that had already buried her knees, both hands pressed against the sucking chest wound beneath Private First Class Martinez's right shoulder, and she was watching the life drain out of his eyes one shallow breath at a time. Behind her, Rodriguez was screaming, or he had been screaming. The morphine was finally taking hold, dulling the edges of the compound fracture that had turned his femur into a jagged collection of bone fragments, threatening to sever his femoral artery with every involuntary muscle spasm. Thompson was quieter, but quiet worried Sarah more. Quiet meant shock was setting in. Quiet meant the body was starting to shut down non-essential functions, conserving blood for the heart and brain, while everything else began the slow process of dying. 3 critical casualties. 0 helicopter support, a blizzard that was getting worse by the minute, and a command decision that had just sentenced all of them to death. Bravo 6, this is Dustoff 37. Weather advisory is now read across all sectors. We are RTB. Repeat, returning to base. Extraction is no longer possible. Advise you shelter in place and await improvement. Over. Sarah heard Captain Morrison's response to the radio static. Something about understanding, about hunkering down, about the storm passing in 6 to 8 hours. 6 to 8 hours. Martinez would be dead in 2. Rodriguez would lose his leg in 3, if the blood loss didn't kill him first. Thompson might last 4, but by then the hypothermia would have done damage that no amount of warming could reverse. She looked up at the swirling white void above her. Snow driving horizontally now, visibility down to 30 meters and dropping. Somewhere out there, Captain Morrison was leading the able-bodied Rangers back toward a defensive position near the ambush site, a collection of boulders that offered minimal protection from the wind and none at all from the cold. He'd made the tactically sound decision, the protocol-approved decision, the decision that military training and operational doctrine had prepared him to make, and it was going to kill every wounded soldier under Sarah's care. If that opening hooked you, stay with me. This story only gets heavier from here. Subscribe now for more war stories like this and hit that notification bell. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 12 hours earlier, the morning had been almost beautiful. Sarah remembered that clearly, the way the November sun had broken through a gap in the cloud cover and painted the eastern ridgelines gold, the crispness of the mountain air that filled her lungs with something that felt almost like peace. Almost. The anxiety never quite went away. For years as a combat medic, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and Sarah still felt that familiar tightening in her chest before every mission. Not fear exactly. She'd made peace with fear a long time ago. This was something deeper. Responsibility. The knowledge that every decision she made in the field could mean the difference between a soldier going home to their family or going home in a flag-draped casket. She'd learned to compartmentalize it. Pack it away in a box labeled deal with later, and focus on the mission. Check her aid bag. Verify her supplies. Run through scenarios in her head. Tourniquets, chest seals, airways, IVs. The litany of life-saving interventions that had become as automatic as breathing. Chun, you good. Staff Sergeant Williams had appeared at her elbow, his weathered face creased with something that might have been concern or might have been simple assessment. Williams was old school, 22 years in the Army, 3 of them as a Ranger, and he'd seen enough medics freeze under fire to know the signs. Good to go, Staff Sergeant. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. Keep your head on a swivel out there. Intelligence says the valley's been quiet, but quiet makes me nervous. Quiet makes everyone nervous. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. That's because quiet usually means they're waiting. The patrol had assembled at 0600. 12 Rangers total. A standard reconnaissance element tasked with assessing enemy movement through the Pancher Valley's northern pass. Captain Morrison led from the front, a West Point graduate with 2 combat deployments, and the kind of confidence that came from never having had that confidence truly tested. Sarah had served under officers like him before. They were good in predictable situations. It was the unpredictable ones that revealed what they were really made of. The route took them along a ridgeline that offered clear sight lines in 3 directions, but exposed them to the wind that was already picking up from the northwest. By 0800, the first clouds had begun to gather over the peaks. By 1000, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By noon, Sarah could see her breath hanging in the air, and the clouds had formed a solid gray ceiling that pressed down on the mountains like a weight. Weather's turning, Jenkins observed. He was the youngest in patrol, 19 years old, barely 6 months out of basic, and still carrying that mix of eagerness and uncertainty that marked every new soldier. Sarah had taken an unofficial interest in him, the way she always did with the youngest ones. They reminded her of her brother. "Weather's always turning up here," she said. "Mountains make their own rules. You think we'll get snow?" Sarah looked up at the sky, at the way the clouds were churning and building, at the particular shade of gray that she'd learned to recognize over 2 Afghan winters. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think we'll get snow." They pushed deeper into the valley. The terrain narrowed as they approached the northern pass. Steep walls of rock rising on either side, channeling them into a corridor that was tactically disadvantageous, but operationally necessary. Intelligence had reported possible enemy movement through this area, and Captain Morrison wanted eyes on the pass before the weather shut everything down. Sarah felt the first flakes of snow hit her face at 1,423 hours. They were light at first, almost playful, drifting down in lazy spirals that melted on contact with warm skin. Within 30 minutes, the spirals had become a steady fall. Within an hour, visibility had dropped to 200 meters. Bravo 6, this is Overlord. Weather update. Storm system moving faster than projected. Advise expedited return to extraction point. Window closing in approximately 4 hours. Captain Morrison acknowledged the transmission, but he didn't turn the patrol around. They were close to their objective. Close enough to push through, gather the intelligence they'd come for, and still make it back before the storm hit full force. Or so he calculated. It was the kind of calculation that worked on paper. The kind of calculation that assumed the enemy hadn't been tracking their movement since they'd entered the valley. The kind of calculation that didn't account for the 12 insurgent fighters who had been waiting in prepared positions along the ridgeline for the past 6 hours, watching patient, their trap perfectly set. The ambush was a masterpiece of tactical execution. Sarah would recognize that later, in the cold clarity of hindsight, the way the insurgents had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, the way they waited until patrol was fully committed to kill zone before opening up, the way they targeted the radio operator first to disrupt communications, and the point man second to pin the formation in place. But in the moment, all Sarah knew was chaos. The first burst of AK-47 fire ripped through the mountain silence at 1,547 hours. Private Collins went down immediately, 2 rounds center mass, dead before he hit the ground. Corporal Hayes, the radio operator, took a round to his pack that destroyed the primary radio and sent him sprawling. Martinez was 3 steps ahead of Sarah when the bullet caught him below the right shoulder, spinning him around with a spray of blood that painted the snow crimson. Contact right. Contact right. The Rangers reacted with a speed born of training and instinct. They dropped to whatever cover they could find, boulders, depressions in the snow, the slight rise of the terrain, and began returning fire. M4S cracked in sharp counterpoint to the deeper thunder of the AK-47s. Tracers drew bright lines to the falling snow, red and green, crisscrossing in a deadly light show that would have been beautiful if it wasn't designed to kill. Sarah was already moving. She low-crawled toward Martinez, ignoring the round snapping overhead, her training taking over while her conscious mind caught up with the situation. He was on his back, both hands pressed against his chest, blood welling between his fingers with every labored breath. Chen's hit. Doc's hit. Negative. Negative. Martinez is hit. I'm with him. She reached him and immediately saw the problem. Penetrating trauma to the right thoracic cavity, probable tension pneumothorax developing. His right lung was collapsing as air leaked into the chest cavity with every breath, compressing the lung and eventually the heart if she didn't intervene. Martinez, look at me. His eyes were wide, panicked, the whites showing around irises that were already starting to lose focus. She grabbed his face with one hand, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I've got you. Breathe slow. I've got you." Her other hand was already digging into her aid bag, finding the chest seal by touch alone. Asherman chest seal, a one-way valve that would allow air to escape from the chest cavity while preventing more from entering. She ripped Martinez's plate carrier open, yanked up his shirt, and slapped the seal into place over the entrance wound. He gasped as the adhesive bit into his skin, but the ragged quality of his breathing began to even out almost immediately. "Rodriguez is down. Doc, Rodriguez is down." Sarah's head snapped up. 20 meters away, Rodriguez was lying in the open, his leg bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. He wasn't screaming, not yet. The shock was still protecting him from the full weight of what had happened to his body. Covering fire now. Someone was shouting, someone was shooting, and Sarah was running. She didn't remember making the decision to move. One moment she was kneeling beside Martinez. The next she was sprinting across open ground with bullets kicking up snow around her feet. Something tugged at her pack, sharp and insistent, but she didn't stop to check what it was. Rodriguez's femur was destroyed. The round had struck just above the knee and fragmented, turning the bone into shrapnel that had torn through muscle, vessels, and flesh. Blood was pumping from the wound in rhythmic spurts that matched his heartbeat. Arterial involvement, the worst possible scenario for a field medic. Sarah had her tourniquet out before she'd finished sliding into position beside him. Combat application tourniquet. CAT, designed to be applied with one hand if necessary. She looped it around his thigh, high and tight, and began twisting the windlass. Rodriguez started screaming. It was a primal sound, torn from somewhere deep in his core, and it cut through the noise of the firefight like a knife. Sarah kept twisting. The tourniquet tightened. The blood flow slowed. The spurting became a trickle and then stopped. Rodriguez was still screaming, his hands clawing at the snow. But he was alive. He was going to stay alive. "Turn. Get to cover. Get to." The explosion cut off whoever was shouting. RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, impacting somewhere to her left. The concussion knocked her sideways, sent snow and debris raining down around her, and for a moment she couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched ringing that seemed to come from inside her own skull. When her hearing returned, she heard Thompson. "My leg. God, my leg." He was 10 meters away, trying to crawl toward cover, leaving a trail of blood in the snow behind him. Another through-and-through wound, lower leg, tibia, and fibula involvement based on the way his foot was dragging. Not immediately life-threatening if she could stop the bleeding, but he wasn't going anywhere under his own power. The firefight was still raging, but something had shifted. The Rangers had found better cover, had begun to suppress the insurgent positions with accurate fire. The enemy's rate of fire was slowing. They were taking casualties or conserving ammunition, or both. Captain Morrison was shouting into the backup radio, calling for air support, calling for extraction, calling for anything that could shift the balance back in their favor. And the snow was getting heavier. Sarah worked on Thompson, while bullets cracked overhead. Pressure bandage on the entry wound, another on the exit. Then she immobilized the lower leg as best she could with what she had available, a splint improvised from the rigid backing of her medical pack. He was pale, sweating despite the cold, but his pulse was strong and his eyes were clear. "You're going to be okay," she told him. "You hear me? You're going to be okay." She didn't know if she was lying. The firefight ended as suddenly as it had begun. One moment the ridge was alive with muzzle flashes. The next, silence. The insurgents were withdrawing, melting back into mountains before the Rangers could organize pursuit, before any air assets could arrive to finish them off. They'd achieved their objective. They bloodied the patrol, killed 2 Rangers, wounded 5 more, and vanished like ghosts into the storm. Captain Morrison materialized out of the swirling snow, his face a mass of controlled intensity. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, shrapnel from the RPG, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Report. Sarah stood, her hands red to the wrist with other men's blood. Collins and Hayes Archaea. Martinez has a penetrating chest wound. I've got a seal on it, but he needs surgical intervention within the next few hours or he's not going to make it. Rodriguez has a compound femur fracture with arterial involvement. Tourniquet applied, but that limb is on borrowed time. Thompson has a through-and-through to the lower leg. Stable for now, but non-ambulatory. Jenkins took a round to the shoulder. Through and through, no bone involvement. He can still walk and fight. And you? Sarah looked down at herself. Her pack had a hole in it that she didn't remember getting. There was blood on her uniform, but she couldn't tell if any of it was hers. I'm functional. Morrison nodded, his jaw tight. The decision came fast. Morrison was already running calculations in his head. Casualty evacuation priorities, defensive positions, the weather window that was closing by the minute. Dust off, this is Bravo 6. We have 3 urgent surgical and 2 priority. Requesting immediate extraction at grid reference 476928. How copy? The response came back broken, fragmented by the storm that was now dumping snow at a rate that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Bravo 6, dust off, weather, negative extraction, current conditions, advise shelter. Say again, dust off. Say again. But the transmission dissolved into static. The mountains were eating the signal, and the storm was making everything worse. Morrison tried 3 more times before he accepted what Sarah had already known the moment she'd seen the color of those clouds. No one was flying in this. The helicopters were grounded, and they were on their own. Listen up. Morrison's voice cut through the wind. The surviving Rangers gathered around him. 8 soldiers total, 5 of them wounded, 3 of those wounds critical. Extraction is delayed. Weather's got everything shut down. We're going to move to secondary defensive position at the rock formation 200 meters east. We dig in, we wait out the storm, and we move for extraction once a bird can fly. Sir, Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the cold that was already seeping through her uniform. Martinez can't wait out the storm. That chest seal is temporary. He needs a hospital, and he needs it within the next 3 to 4 hours or the internal damage is going to kill him. I understand that, Sergeant, but flying is not possible in these conditions. What about ground evacuation? There's an abandoned research station approximately 8 miles northwest. Soviet era, possibly Western after that. If it's still standing, it might have shelter, maybe even communications equipment. Morrison shook his head. 8 miles through a blizzard with 3 non-ambulatory casualties? That's not evacuation. Chun, that's suicide. With respect, sir, staying here is suicide. We have no shelter from the wind, minimal supplies, and 3 soldiers who are going to die before morning if they don't get proper treatment. At least moving gives us a chance. And how exactly do you propose we move them? You want to carry 3 stretchers through a wideout for 8 miles? If that's what it takes, yes. The silence that followed was filled with the howling of the wind and the soft groans of the wounded. Morrison stared at her, his expression unreadable, snow accumulating on his shoulders and in the creases of his face. The answer is no, Sergeant. We shelter in place. That's an order. Sarah felt something break inside her. Not break as in failure, but break as in release. The last restraint giving way. The final barrier between protocol and conscience crumbling in the face of certain death. Then I'm requesting permission to attempt evacuation independently, sir. Request denied. Sir, I said no, Chun. I'm not losing more soldiers to this mountain because one medic thinks she knows better than operational doctrine. We stay together, we stay alive. That's final. He turned away, began organizing the movement to the defensive position. The other Rangers fell in, some of them casting uncertain glances at Sarah, others too focused on survival to care about the argument they'd just witnessed. Within minutes, the able-bodied soldiers were helping to move the wounded toward the rock formation, struggling against the wind that seemed determined to tear them off the mountain. Sarah stayed behind. She told herself it was to perform a final check on her patients. Told herself it was to gather supplies that might have been dropped in the chaos. Told herself anything except the truth, which was that she'd already made her decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. The moment came when the last of the Rangers disappeared into the white void. 1 second they were visible, struggling shapes against the storm. The next, they were gone, swallowed by snow that was falling so thick and fast that the world had been reduced to a 20-meter circle with Sarah at its center. She was alone with the 3 worst wounded. Martinez, fighting for every breath. Rodriguez, semi-conscious from pain and morphine. Thompson, shivering uncontrollably as his body tried to generate heat it couldn't afford to lose. Chun. Jenkins emerged from the white. He was holding his injured shoulder with his good hand, blood seeping between his fingers. But there was something in his eyes that she recognized. Determination. Maybe something close to defiance. You're supposed to be with the captain. I know. He dropped to one knee beside Rodriguez's makeshift stretcher, insulation blankets and paracord that Sarah had rigged during the firefight. But I figure you're going to need help carrying 3 men through a blizzard, and I'm the only one stupid enough to volunteer. Jenkins, you're wounded. You should... Should what? Go wait in a pile of rocks for helicopters that aren't coming? Watch these men die because the captain's too proud to admit there might be another option. He met her gaze, steady despite the pain. I heard what you said, document, about the research station, about moving, and I think you're right. I think staying put is how we all freeze to death tonight. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. He was 19 years old, barely more than a kid, and he was offering to walk into a storm that could kill him just as easily as it could kill the men they were trying to save. If we do this, she said slowly, if we leave, we're violating a direct order. You understand that? We're not following the patrol anymore. We're on our own. I understand. There's a good chance we won't make it. 8 miles in these conditions, carrying wounded, with limited supplies, the odds are not in our favor. Better than 0. What? The odds of them surviving if we stay. Jenkins looked down at Rodriguez, at the makeshift tourniquet that was keeping him alive minute by minute. That's 0. So whatever you're offering, it's better than 0. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this could go wrong, all the reasons they should follow protocol, and trust the system and wait for rescue. But the system had failed them. Protocol had failed them. The helicopters weren't coming, and the storm wasn't stopping, and 3 soldiers were dying in front of her while she debated the ethics of disobedience. Okay. She reached into her pack, pulled out the map she'd memorized during mission planning. The research station was marked, a small symbol that might as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. We move fast, we move smart, we don't stop for anything except medical emergencies. You take point when I'm working on patients. I take point when you need to rest. We switch off carrying stretchers. I'll take the lead position, you take the rear. Questions? Just one. Jenkins grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You ever done anything this crazy before? No. Sarah folded the map and tucked it into her jacket. But there's a first time for everything. They rigged the stretchers as best they could. 2 improvised litters. Insulation blankets stretched over frameworks of branches and tent poles, secured with paracord in configurations that would hold under stress. Martinez and Thompson shared one stretcher, their lesser weight combined making the load manageable. Rodriguez got the second stretcher himself. Any movement of his shattered leg would be agony, and Sarah couldn't risk him thrashing and making the injury worse. This is going to hurt, she told Rodriguez as they prepared to move. I've given you as much morphine as I safely can, but you're going to feel it. Every step, every bump, every time we have to adjust the stretcher. I need you to stay as still as possible. Can you do that? His eyes were glassy, pupils dilated from the drugs, but he managed to nod. I'll try. That's all I ask. The first steps were the hardest, not because of the weight. Though the weight was considerable, 200 pounds of human being distributed across a makeshift frame that dug into Sarah's shoulders with every stride. The hardest part was the direction. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to follow the fading tracks toward a defensive position, to rejoin her unit and trust in the collective. Instead, she turned north into the teeth of the storm, toward a research station that might not even exist anymore. The wind hit them like a wall. It came screaming down from the peaks, laden with ice crystals that stung exposed skin and found their way into every gap in clothing, every seam, every fold. Within minutes, Sarah's face was numb. Within 30 minutes, she couldn't feel her fingers. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying, and she hadn't come this far to die. How far? Jenkins shouted from behind her. His voice was barely audible over the howling wind. 8 miles. Give or take. In this? How far? Jenkins shouted from behind her. His voice was barely audible over the howling wind. 8 miles. Give or take. In this. They moved in silence after that, conserving energy, conserving heat, conserving everything they had for the task ahead. Sarah fell into a rhythm. Step, drag, her body operating on autopilot while her mind monitored the situation. Martinez's breathing, Rodriguez's pulse, Thompson's color, the direction of the wind, the angle of the slope, the feel of the snow beneath her boots. They'd been walking for 2 hours when Martinez stopped breathing. It happened without warning. One moment his chest was rising and falling in that labored, rattling rhythm that had become the soundtrack to their journey. The next, nothing. Silence except for the wind. Jenkins, stop. Sarah dropped her end of the stretcher, fell to her knees beside Martinez. His face was gray, his lips turning blue. The chest seal over his wound no longer rising and falling with each attempted breath. The tension pneumothorax had worsened. Air was filling his chest cavity faster than the seal could release it, compressing his lung, compressing his heart, killing him one failed heartbeat at a time. Needle decompression. I need to decompress his chest. She was already digging through her aid bag, fingers numb and clumsy, searching for 14-gauge needle that could save his life. Found it. Ripped open the sterile packaging with her teeth. Located the second intercostal space on his right side, mid-clavicular line, just below the collarbone. Hold him still. Jenkins grabbed Martinez's shoulders as Sarah drove the needle home. There was resistance, skin, muscle, the tough membrane of the pleura, and then a hiss of air as pressure escaped from the chest cavity. Martinez's body convulsed, his back arching off the stretcher, and then he was breathing again. Gasping, ragged, but breathing. That was too close, Jenkins muttered. That was what it needed to be. Sarah checked the needle placement, taped it in place, and reached for her stethoscope. Lung sound on the right side were still diminished, but present. He was stable again. For now, we need to move faster. The cold is making everything worse. Blood is thickening, clotting slower, and the decreased circulation is affecting how his body fights the damage. If we don't get him somewhere warm in the next few hours. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They pushed on. The terrain grew steeper, the snow deeper, the wind somehow even more vicious. Sarah lost track of time, lost track of distance, lost track of everything except the next step. Left foot, right foot, don't stop, don't think, just move. At some point, Thompson regained full consciousness. Sarah heard him first, a low moan that rose into words. Doc, where are we? Moving. We're getting you to safety. My leg, I can't feel my leg. That was bad. That was very bad. Loss of sensation meant nerve damage, meant circulation problems, meant the wound was worse than she'd initially assessed or the cold was doing additional harm. Maybe both. Don't worry about your leg right now. Just focus on staying awake. Talk to me. Tell me about home. Home? Yeah, where you from? Texas. The word came out with something that might have been a weak smile. Little town south of Houston. You probably never heard of it. Tell me anyway. He talked. Sarah half listened, using his voice as a gauge for his mental status, while her eyes stayed locked on the terrain ahead. The ground was rising. They were climbing now, moving toward the pass that would lead them into the valley where the research station waited. If it was still there, if they could find it, if 100 other things went right when everything else had gone wrong. Jenkins, how's Rodriguez? Still out. Pulse is steady, though. You want me to check the tourniquet? No, don't touch it. If it's still holding, we leave it alone. They crested the pass as the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Sarah didn't know exactly how cold it was. Cold enough that every breath felt like inhaling razor blades. Cold enough that the tears leaking from her wind-scoured eyes froze on her cheeks. Cold enough that survival had become a purely mechanical process of refusing to stop. The valley opened before them, a vast white emptiness that stretched into darkness. Somewhere in that emptiness was a research station. 8 miles, she'd said. But how far had they come? 2 miles? 3? In these conditions, with visibility down to 30 meters and no landmarks to gauge distance, She could only guess. This way. She picked a direction based on her memory of the map, based on the angle of the mountain, based on instinct more than anything else. Stay close. We stop for nothing now. Hour 5, or maybe hour 6. Time had lost meaning somewhere in the white void, replaced by a simple equation. Forward equals life, stopping equals death. Sarah clung to that equation like a lifeline, letting it pull her through the exhaustion that had become a physical weight on her shoulders, through the cold that had stopped hurting and started simply being a fundamental condition of existence as unavoidable as gravity. She checked on her patients every 15 minutes. It was the only schedule she maintained, the only structure in a world that had been reduced to wind and snow and the terrible simplicity of survival. Martinez, breathing still labored but present, skin color transitioning from gray to something slightly warmer, though that might have been wishful thinking. The needle decompression was holding, releasing enough pressure to keep his lung functioning, but it was a temporary measure. Every minute without proper surgical intervention was another minute of damage accumulating, another minute of risk multiplying. Rodriguez, deeply unconscious now, which was probably a mercy, his shattered femur would have made every jolt of the stretcher an agony if he'd been aware. The tourniquet had been in place for over 8 hours, past the generally accepted threshold for limb salvage. Sarah knew what that meant. Even if they survived the night, Rodriguez would likely lose a leg. But a leg was a price worth paying for a life. Thompson, alert, which was both good and bad. Good because consciousness meant his brain was still getting adequate oxygen. Bad because awareness meant he could feel the cold creeping into his bones, feel the numbness spreading up his leg, feel the terror of not knowing whether he would survive the next hour. Document. His voice was thin, stretched tight by pain and cold. Doc, I can't feel anything below my knee anymore. Nothing at all. Sarah kept her face neutral, her voice calm. That's the cold affecting your circulation. Once we get you warmed up, sensation should return. Will. She made it a statement, an assertion of will against the chaos of reality. It will return. You're going to be fine, Thompson. You're going to walk out of here on your own 2 feet. She didn't know if she was lying. She'd said a lot of things tonight that might turn out to be lies. But lies that kept soldiers fighting were better than truths that made them give up. Jenkins, how are you holding up? The young private was staggering now, his movements jerky and uncoordinated in ways that set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. Hypothermia affected everyone differently, but the early signs were always the same. Confusion, loss of motor control, irrational behavior. Cold, he said. The word came out slurred. Really cold, document. Talk to me. What's your name? Jenkins. Private First Class Marcus Jenkins. Good. Where are you from? Ohio. Cleveland. Cleveland. What's it like there? Cold. A weak laugh. But not like this. Nothing's cold like this. They kept moving. Sarah talked. Not because she had anything particular to say, but because silence was dangerous. Silence let the cold win. Silence let the exhaustion creep in. Silence let soldiers decide that stopping for just a moment wouldn't hurt, that rest in their eyes wouldn't kill them, that the snow was actually quite warm if you just let yourself sink into it. She'd seen it happen before. Soldiers in the final stages of hypothermia, stripping off their clothes because their dying brains were telling them they were overheating. Soldiers curling up in the snow with peaceful expressions, falling asleep and never waking up. The mountain was patient. The mountain was always patient. It would wait for you to make one mistake, and then it would take you. Tell me about your family, Jenkins. You have family back home. My mom and my little sister, Keisha. She's 12. What's Keisha like? Smart. Way smarter than me. She's going to be a doctor someday, like a real doctor, not a... He trailed off, confused. Not a what? I don't know. I forgot what I was saying. Confusion. Worsening. Sarah needed to get him warm, needed to get all of them warm, but there was nowhere to stop, nowhere to shelter, nothing but the endless white expanse and the research station that might not even exist. Keep talking, Jenkins. Tell me about Keisha. Tell me what she wants to be when she grows up. A doctor, or a lawyer, or both. She says you can be both if you're smart enough. And she's smart enough? Keisha's smart enough for anything. They walked. They talked. Sarah's world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next check on her patients. Martinez was still breathing. Rodriguez was still unconscious. Thompson was still aware. Those responses were getting slower. Jenkins was deteriorating, but slowly, which meant she had time. How much time? She didn't know. Time had become an abstract concept, measured not in minutes or hours, but in heartbeats and breaths and steps forward. The wind shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight change in direction, a marginal decrease in intensity. But Sarah noticed immediately. Anything different was worth noticing. Anything different might be a clue, a sign, a hint that the universe hadn't completely abandoned them. Do you smell that? Jenkins sniffed the air, his face blank with confusion. Smell what? I don't know. Something. Something that isn't snow. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the overwhelming sensory assault of the blizzard. But it was there, a hint of something organic. With smoke? Old construction? She couldn't identify it, but it was different, and different meant possibility. This way. She adjusted their course slightly, following her nose like an animal tracking prey. The smell grew stronger, and then a shape looming out of the white, angular, artificial, unmistakably human-made. Jenkins, do you see that? See what? He couldn't see it. His vision was failing along with everything else. But Sarah could see it, and what she saw made her want to cry. The research station, still standing after all these years, its concrete walls streaked with ice but intact, its roof still attached despite decades of mountain storms. Soviet-era construction, built to withstand conditions exactly like these. The windows were dark, the door buried under a drift of snow. But it was there. It was real. We made it. Her voice came out as a croak. Jenkins, we made it. Come on. A little further. Just a little further. She pulled him forward, dragging the stretcher with Thompson and Martinez, calling back to Jenkins to keep up, to not stop, to push through the final 100 meters that stood between them and survival. The building grew larger, more solid, more real. The door was visible now, a heavy metal affair with Russian lettering stenciled on its surface. Sarah reached the door and pulled. It didn't move. Frozen shut, ice bonding metal to frame and a seal that might as well have been welded. She pulled again, throwing her entire weight against it, but the door refused to budge. No, not after everything. Not like this. She stepped back, drew her pistol, and fired 3 rounds into the ice around the door frame. The sound was deafening after hours of nothing but wind. The ice cracked, fractured, fell away in chunks. She grabbed the door handle and pulled again. This time it moved. The interior of the research station was dark, cold, and abandoned, but it was shelter, true shelter, with walls that blocked the wind and a roof that held back the snow. Sarah felt the change immediately as she dragged the first stretcher inside. The temperature wasn't warm by any definition, but without the wind chill factor, it felt almost tropical by comparison. Jenkins, come on, get inside. Help me get everyone in. He stumbled through the door, barely able to stay upright, and collapsed against the nearest wall. His lips were blue, his eyes unfocused, and Sarah added him to her list of immediate concerns. But first, she needed to assess the space. Tactical flashlight out. She swept the beam across the interior. One main room, maybe 40 feet by 30, cluttered with old equipment and furniture. A hallway leading to what looked like smaller offices or storage areas. And, thank God, a fireplace. An actual fireplace, with a chimney that might still function, and a stack of dried wood that previous occupants had left behind. Jenkins, stay here. Keep talking. Don't fall asleep. Okay. His voice was barely a whisper. Sarah worked fast, her body operating on reserves she didn't know she had. She got Rodriguez and a stretcher inside, positioned him near where the fire would be, then Martinez and Thompson. Then she closed the door against the storm, wedging it shut with debris to keep the wind out. The fireplace. Everything depended on the fireplace. She cleared the grate, arranged kindling from the old wood pile, and used her lighter to start a flame. It caught, smoked, guttered. For one horrible moment, she thought the chimney was blocked. Thought they'd die in here from smoke inhalation instead of cold. Then the draft caught, and the smoke began to rise. The flame steadied, grew, and Sarah fed it more wood until it was burning properly. Heat began to radiate outward, weak at first but growing, pushing back the cold that had been killing them inch by inch. Fire's going. She moved to Jenkins first. He was the most mobile, which made him the most dangerous case. Paradoxical undressing was a real risk in severe hypothermia. His confused brain decided he was overheating. He might strip off his clothes and seal his own death. Jenkins. Marcus. Look at me. His eyes swam into focus. Doc, you're going to sit right here by the fire. You're going to keep your clothes on. You're going to drink water when I give it to you. Understand? Understand? She positioned him where the heat could reach him, but not too close. Rewarming too fast was almost as dangerous as the cold itself. Peripheral vasoconstriction had kept his core warm at the expense of his extremities. If blood flow returned too quickly, the cold blood from his arms and legs would flood back to his heart and potentially stop it. Then she turned to her critical patients. Martinez first. His breathing had stabilized during the final stretch, the needle decompression still holding, but she needed to do a full assessment. She cut away his shirt with her trauma shears, exposing the chest wound and the seal she'd applied hours ago in the snow. The area around the wound was angry and inflamed, but there was no sign of spreading infection. Yet, the needle in his chest was still venting air with each breath, preventing another tension pneumothorax. She checked his vitals. Pulse, 112, elevated but not critical. Blood pressure, difficult to measure without proper equipment, but his radial pulse was present, which meant systolic was at least above 80. Temperature, low, dangerously low, but the fire would help with that. Martinez, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open. Doc, you're alive. We made it to shelter. I need you to stay calm and keep breathing. Can you do that? Yeah. A weak cough. Yeah, I can do that. Rodriguez next. His femur was still destroyed, the tourniquet still in place. But something had changed. The color of his leg below the tourniquet was wrong. Not the pink of healthy tissue or even the pale of reduced blood flow, but a mottled gray-white that made Sarah's stomach sink. She loosened the tourniquet slightly, watching for any sign of bleeding, watching the leg for any change in color. Nothing. The tissue was dead. 12 hours plus a restricted blood flow, combined with the cold, combined with the trauma. His leg was gone. The only question now was how far up the damage extended. I'm sorry, she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. I'm so sorry. She retightened the tourniquet. Losing the leg was certain. Losing him was not. As long as his vital organs kept functioning, he could survive this. He could wake up. He could learn to walk again with prosthetics and go home to his family and live a life worth living. A leg was a terrible price, but it wasn't everything. Thompson was last. His lower leg was concerning. The through-and-through wound had damaged bone and possibly nerve, and the prolonged cold exposure had likely worsened the situation. But he was stable. His vitals were better than anyone else's, and his mental status was clearer. Document. He grabbed her arm as she checked his bandages. Where are we? Research station. Abandoned, but it's shelter. We're gonna be okay. How long? How long were we out there? I don't know exactly. 10 hours. Maybe 12. 12 hours. He let out a shaky breath. 12 hours in that storm, and you carried us the whole way. Jenkins helped. Jenkins could barely stand. You carried us. Document. You saved our lives. Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She'd done what needed to be done. That was all. That was always all. Get some rest. I need to see if there's any communication equipment in this building. She left by the fire and began exploring the research station. The hallway led to 3 smaller rooms, a storage area filled with old equipment, an office with a desk and rotting paper, and what looked like a radio room. Sarah felt her heart skip when she saw it. A radio. Communications. If it worked, if any of it still worked, she could call for help. The equipment was old, Soviet era, then upgraded at some point with Western tech, then abandoned again. Layers of history, layers of neglect. But in the corner, she found something different. A solar-powered emergency radio, portable, still in its original packaging. Someone had brought it here and never used it, never needed it. Sarah needed it now. She pulled the radio out, checked the battery indicator. Dead. But solar-powered meant rechargeable, and there was a hand crank backup built into design. She started cranking, her arms screaming in protest after 12 hours of carrying stretchers through a blizzard. Crank, crank, crank. The indicator light flickered, died, flickered again, held. She adjusted the frequency, scanning for military bands, for emergency channels, for anything that might reach the outside world. Static, more static, and then any station. This is Overlord Base. Repeat any station. Sarah grabbed the handset, her voice cracking as she spoke. Overlord Base, this is Sergeant Chun, 75th Ranger Regiment, Bravo Company. I have 4 casualties, including 3 urgent surgical. Requesting immediate medevac at grid. She rattled off the coordinates from memory, praying they were right, praying the storm had cleared enough for helicopters to fly, praying for anything that might bring her soldiers home. Sergeant Chun, we copy your transmission. Be advised, storm is clearing in your sector. We are launching medevac birds now. ETA to your location, approximately 90 minutes. Can you mark your position? Affirmative. We're in an abandoned research station. Structure should be visible from the air. I'll have a signal fire burning. Copy that, Sergeant. Help is on the way. Overlord out. Sarah lowered the handset, and for the first time in 12 hours, she allowed herself to cry. The 90 minutes were the longest of her life. Sarah spent them doing what she'd been trained to do, maintaining her patients, monitoring vitals, adjusting treatments, and refusing to let hope become complacency. Just because rescue was coming didn't mean her soldiers were safe. They were still hypothermic, still wounded, still balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. She kept the fire burning, not just for warmth, but as a signal. The flames would be visible from the air, a beacon in the white wilderness. She positioned her flashlight in the window, clicking it on and off in a pattern that might catch a pilot's eye. She did everything she could think of and then invented new things to do. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the full weight of what she'd just done. 12 hours, 8 miles, 3 critical casualties. The numbers were abstract. The reality was anything but. Jenkins was the first to recover enough to be useful. He sat by the fire, color returning to his face, his eyes clearing as his core temperature normalized. Document. What can I do? Stay warm. Rest. There has to be something. You carried a stretcher through a blizzard with a bullet wound in your shoulder. You've done enough. He shook his head. It doesn't feel like enough. Sarah understood that feeling better than she could express. It never felt like enough. No matter how many lives you saved, there was always someone you couldn't reach. Always someone who slipped away while you were working on someone else. Always a ghost of the patient you lost haunting the ones you kept. Then talk to them, she said finally. Talk to Martinez and Thompson. Keep them awake. Keep them focused. That's what they need right now. Jenkins nodded and crawled over to where Martinez was lying. Sarah heard him start talking. Something about baseball, about the Cleveland Indians, about a game he'd seen as a kid with his father. Martinez's responses were weak but present, and Sarah allowed herself a small measure of relief. She checked Rodriguez again. Still unconscious. Still stable, his vitals holding in that precarious zone between critical and catastrophic. The leg was definitely gone. There was no miracle that would reverse 12 hours of ischemia, but the rest of him had a chance. A good chance, if they could get him to a surgical table soon enough. The sound of helicopter rotors reached her ears at the 87-minute mark. Sarah was outside before she consciously decided to move, waving her flashlight, shouting into the wind that had finally begun to die down. The storm was breaking, patches of sky visible between the clouds, and descending through one of those patches was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. A black hawk with a red cross on its side. Here, we're here. The helicopter circled once, twice, then set down in the only clear space available, a patch of flat ground about 50 meters from the research station. Before the rotors had even stopped spinning, the crew was out, stretchers in hand, sprinting toward the building. For casualties, 3 critical, 1 stable. The flight medic reached her first, his face a mask of professional concern. Talk to me, Sergeant. What do we got? Martinez, penetrating chest wound, possible bilateral lung involvement. I've got a needle decompression in place, and a chest seal on the entrance wound. Rodriguez, compound femur fracture with tourniquet application for approximately 13 hours. The leg is non-viable, but his vitals are stable. Thompson, through and through to the lower leg with bone involvement, stable condition, ambulatory with assistance. Jenkins, shoulder wound and moderate hypothermia, recovering. The flight medic nodded, relaying the information to his team as they swept into the research station. Sarah followed, watching as they transferred her patients onto proper stretchers with proper equipment, as they started IVs and hung fluids, and did all the things she'd been unable to do in the field. Martinez was loaded first, then Rodriguez, still unconscious, his ruined leg strapped securely to prevent further damage. Thompson went next, managing a weak thumbs up as the crew carried him past. Jenkins walked on his own power, supported by a crew member on each side. Sergeant Chun. The flight medic had returned, his expression unreadable. You need to come to. You're showing signs of severe hypothermia and frostbite. The docs back at base are going to want to look at you. Sarah looked down at her hands for the first time in hours. They were white, waxy, the skin stretched tight over knuckles that had lost all feeling. Her feet felt like blocks of ice, and now that the adrenaline was fading, she could feel the exhaustion dragging at her like a physical weight. I'm fine. With respect, Sergeant, you're about 30 minutes from losing some fingers. Get on the bird. She got on the bird. The flight back to base took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of watching the medical crew work on her soldiers. 40 minutes of answering questions about what had happened, how they'd gotten here, what she'd done to keep them alive. She answered on autopilot, her conscious mind already drifting toward the crash that was coming, the inevitable collapse when the crisis was over and there was nothing left to do but feel. They landed at the forward operating base, and the casualties were rushed to the surgical unit. Sarah tried to follow, but someone, a corpsman, a nurse, someone in scrubs, stopped her. Sergeant, you need treatment too. This way. She let herself be led. Let them examine her hands and feet. Let them wrap her in warming blankets and start in 4 of warm saline. Let them do whatever they needed to do while her mind stayed locked on the surgical bay where her soldiers were fighting for their lives. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. She couldn't tell anymore. Sergeant Chun, a doctor, still in surgical greens, blood on his forearms. Your patients are stable. All 3 of them. Martinez is going to need additional surgery for the lung damage, but he's going to make it. Rodriguez, we couldn't save a leg. Amputation below the knee, but he's going to live. Thompson is the easiest case. He'll need physical therapy, but full recovery is expected. Sarah nodded. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Sergeant. The doctor's voice softened. What you did out there, 12 hours, 8 miles, 3 critical casualties in blizzard conditions. You saved their lives. All of them. You should know that. She found her voice. I did what needed to be done. You did something impossible. He paused. Get some rest. You've earned it. He left, and Sarah sat alone in the treatment room, warming blankets wrapped around her shoulders, for dripping steadily into her arm. For the first time since the ambush, she had nothing to do, no patients to monitor, no stretchers to carry, no decisions to make. Prefab building that had been made as comfortable as possible given the circumstances, which wasn't very comfortable at all, to give her account of the events on the mountain. Colonel Harrison sat behind a metal desk that was older than Sarah's military career. He was a career officer, gray at the temples, hard around the eyes, with a reputation for fairness that was balanced by an equal reputation for adherence to regulation. Captain Morrison was there too, standing at attention against the far wall. He hadn't spoken to Sarah since the rescue, hadn't looked at her. She didn't know if that was guilt or anger or something else entirely. Sergeant Chun. Colonel Harrison's voice was neutral, carefully stripped of any inflection that might reveal his thoughts. This is an informal inquiry to establish the facts of the incident at Pancher Valley. Your account will be recorded. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Please describe, in your own words, the events that occurred following the ambush on your patrol. Sarah described them. The ambush, the casualties, the communication breakdown, Captain Morrison's order to shelter in place, her assessment that sheltering would result in the deaths of her critical patients, her decision to disobey the order and attempt independent evacuation. She kept her voice level professional, sticking to facts rather than emotions. She didn't justify. She didn't explain. She simply reported what had happened and let the colonel draw his own conclusions. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Captain Morrison. The colonel turned his attention to the other officer. Is Sergeant Chen's account accurate? The basic facts are accurate, sir. Morrison's voice was tight. What she fails to mention is that her decision to leave the patrol put her own life at risk and violated a direct order in a combat situation. If the evacuation had failed, if she and the wounded had died in that storm, it would have been a preventable tragedy caused by insubordination. But the evacuation didn't fail. No, sir, it didn't. And if Sergeant Chun had followed your order, if she had sheltered in place and waited for extraction, Morrison hesitated. I believe that is based on my assessment at the time. Captain, the colonel's voice hardened. If Sergeant Chun had followed your order, would her patients have survived the night? The silence stretched. Finally, Morrison answered, Probably not, sir. Probably not. The colonel nodded slowly. Thank you, Captain. You're dismissed. Morrison left. The door closed behind him with a sound that seemed to echo in the small space. Sergeant Chun. The colonel leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from official to something more personal. What you did on that mountain was extraordinary. It was also, technically, a violation of military regulations regarding chain of command and operational protocol. I understand, sir. Do you? He fixed her with a gaze that seemed to see straight through her. You made a decision that saved 3 lives. You also made a decision that could have ended 4, including your own. In the military, we have protocols for a reason. We have chains of command for a reason. The system exists because individual judgment, no matter how well-intentioned, can be wrong, can get people killed. Yes, sir. That said, he sighed, and suddenly he looked very tired. The system also exists to save lives. When the system fails, when weather grounds our helicopters and terrain defeats our technology and the enemy catches us off guard, someone has to make a decision. Someone has to choose between what the rules say and what the situation demands. Sarah waited, unsure where this was going. You made that choice, Sergeant. You chose your patients over your orders, and they live because of it. He stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. Captain Morrison will not face disciplinary action. His decision to shelter in place was reasonable given the information he had at the time, but he also will not be recommended for advancement this cycle. He needs to learn that leadership isn't about following the book. It's about knowing when the book isn't enough. And me, sir, you. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. You're being promoted to staff sergeant, effective immediately. You're also being nominated for the Bronze Star for Valor. The division commander will make the final decision, but I don't anticipate any problems. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the release of tension she hadn't known she was carrying. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Sergeant. You earned it. He paused. One more thing. When you're fully recovered, I want you to consider a new assignment. We're establishing an advanced training program for combat medics, a curriculum focused on field decision-making, improvised care, survival under extreme conditions. I'd like you to help design it. Teach the next generation what you learned on that mountain. What I learned, sir, that sometimes following orders gets people killed. That protocol is a guide, not a straitjacket. That a medic's job isn't just to apply tourniquets and chest seals. It's to keep soldiers alive by whatever means necessary, regardless of what the manual says. He extended his hand. Sarah shook it. Think about it, Sergeant. You don't have to decide now. But she already had. Martinez went home 6 weeks after the evacuation. His wife Maria met him at the airport. Their 3 children crowding around his wheelchair with the reckless energy of kids who didn't fully understand how close they'd come to losing their father. Sarah wasn't there. She was still at the forward operating base, still recovering from a frostbite that had cost her 2 toes and most of the feeling in her left hand. But Martinez's wife sent her a letter, handwritten on paper that smelled faintly of perfume, that said everything Sarah needed to know. "You brought my husband home," Maria wrote. "I don't know how you did it. I don't know what it cost you. But you brought him home, and that means everything. My children still have their father. I still have my partner. You gave us that. I will never be able to repay you, but I will spend the rest of my life being grateful." Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the lockbox where she kept her most important possessions. Rodriguez took longer. The amputation had been clean. The surgeons had done excellent work, all things considered. But recovery from that kind of trauma was measured in months, not weeks. Physical therapy, phantom limb pain, the psychological adjustment of learning to see himself as someone who was whole despite being missing a piece. Sarah visited him at the military hospital. For months after the evacuation, he was in a wheelchair, a prosthetic leg propped beside his bed, and he was arguing with physical therapists about whether he was ready to start walking. "I did 6 miles in the snow without a leg," he was saying as Sarah walked in. "I think I can handle a lap around the therapy room." "You did 6 miles unconscious while someone else carried you," the therapist replied dryly. "That doesn't count. It should count for something." "Rodriguez." Sarah's voice cut through the argument. He looked up, and his face split into a grin. "Document. About time you showed up." She pulled up a chair beside his bed, ignoring the therapist who quietly excused herself. "How are you doing?" "Living the dream." He gestured at the prosthetic. "They tell me in another month I'll be able to walk without looking like a newborn deer." 2 months after that, running. They've got guys out here who ran marathons on these things. Marathons. Can you believe that? "I believe you'll do whatever you set your mind to." His expression softened. "Doc, Sarah, I never got to thank you properly for what you did. Everyone tells me the story. 12 hours, 8 miles, blizzard conditions, but I don't remember any of it. I just remember waking up in a hospital bed with 2 legs worth of phantom pain and 1 leg to show for it. I'm sorry about the leg." "Don't be." He shook his head. "I've got a daughter. Did you know that? Sophia. She just turned 15. I was supposed to be there for her quinceañera, and I missed it because I was busy bleeding out in the snow. I'm sorry, but I made it to her 16th birthday and her 17th, and I'll make every birthday after that because of you." He reached out and took her hand. The leg was a price, an acceptable price. "I've still got everything that matters." "What are you going to do after you're discharged?" "College." He laughed at her expression. "I know, right? The combat engineer is going back to school. But I've been thinking, there's got to be more to life than blowing things up. Maybe I'll teach. Help kids who grew up like I did, you know? Give them options." "That sounds good. That sounds really good. What about you, Doc? What's next?" Sarah told him about the training program, about the colonel's offer, about the possibility of shaping the next generation of combat medics. Rodriguez listened, nodding slowly. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You should do it," he said finally, "not because you owe anyone anything, but because what you learned up there, how to keep people alive when everything's going wrong. That's something you can't learn from a textbook. That's something you have to feel. And if you can teach other people to feel it, to understand it, you'll save more lives from a classroom than you ever could from a foxhole." Sarah thought about that for a long time after she left the hospital. Thompson was the easiest of the 3. His recovery was straightforward. Physical therapy, rest, time. And within 4 months, he was clear to return to active duty. He re-enlisted immediately, requested assignment to the same Ranger unit, and was back in the field before the year was out. He sent Sarah a postcard from his new deployment. It showed a sunset over some desert landscape, generic enough to pass military censorship. On the back, he'd written 2 words, "Still walking." It was enough. Jenkins went a different direction, entirely. His experience on the mountain had changed something in him, not broken exactly, but reshaped. He applied for officer training school and was accepted. The last Sarah heard, he was second in his class, being groomed for a leadership position that would take him far beyond anything his 19-year-old self could have imagined. He called her once, late at night, his voice thick with something that might have been exhaustion or emotion. "Doc, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night on the mountain, when you decided to leave the patrol and try the evacuation, how did you know it was the right decision? How did you know we'd make it?" Sarah considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "I didn't," she said finally. "I had no idea if we'd make it. I just knew that staying meant dying. And die without trying, that wasn't something I could live with." "So you just chose?" "I chose. And then I kept choosing. Every step, every minute, every time I wanted to stop and give up, I chose to take one more step. That's all survival is. Jenkins, one choice at a time, over and over, until you're either safe or dead." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Thank you," document, "for everything. Thank me by being a good leader. Take care of your soldiers." "I will. I promise." He hung up, and Sarah sat alone in her quarters, thinking about choices and survival, and the strange alchemy that turned impossible situations into something you could walk away from. The Bronze Star ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the evacuation. Sarah stood at attention in her dress uniform, the fabric feeling strange after so long in combat gear, while Colonel Harrison read the citation aloud to the assembled troops. For valorous achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Sergeant Sarachin distinguished herself by exceptionally meritorious conduct in performance of outstanding services, in the face of insurmountable obstacles and life-threatening conditions. The words washed over her like water, familiar and distant at the same time. She'd never been comfortable with ceremonies, with the formal recognition of things she'd done because they needed doing. The medal was a symbol, nothing more, a piece of metal that represented something far more complex and ambiguous than any citation could capture. Sergeant Chen's actions resulted in the saving of 3 lives and exemplified the highest traditions of military service in the United States Army. The colonel pinned the medal to her chest. There was applause. There were handshakes and photographs and well wishes from soldiers she barely knew. And then it was over, and she was alone again, standing outside the ceremony hall with a Bronze Star on her chest and no idea what to do next. "Sergeant Chun." She turned. A young woman in a medic's uniform was standing a few feet away, uncertain, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to, I heard about what you did on the mountain, and I wanted to ask." "Ask what?" "How do you do it? How do you keep going when everything's falling apart? When people are dying and there's nothing you can do when the mission is failing and—" She trailed off, embarrassed by her own question. Sarah studied her. Young, early 20s at most, fresh out of training, probably still carrying the idealism and the fear that combat hadn't yet burned away. "What's your name?" "Specialist Torres, ma'am." "Torres." Sarah nodded slowly. "You want to know how I do it?" The honest answer is, I don't know. Every situation is different. Every patient is different. You can train and prepare and memorize protocols until you can do them in your sleep, but when everything goes wrong, and it will go wrong, you have to trust yourself, trust your training, trust your instincts. But what if my instincts are wrong? Then you learn, and you do better next time. Sarah paused. The soldiers you save won't remember every decision you made. They'll remember that you were there, that you didn't give up on them, that you kept fighting even when it looked hopeless. That's what matters. Torres was silent for a moment. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Torres." Sarah stopped her before she could leave. "You ever need to talk about this job, about what you see out there, about any of it, come find me. My door's open." "Really? Really?" Torres smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen on her face. Then she was gone, absorbed back into the crowd, and Sarah was alone again. She looked down at the medal on her chest. It caught the light, gleaming softly. Something had shifted in her, she realized, during the ceremony, during the conversation with Torres, during the months of recovery and reflection that had followed the evacuation. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that ambush. The mountain had changed her, not by adding anything new, but by revealing what had always been there. The capacity for endurance, the willingness to sacrifice, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And now, she had a choice about what to do with it. The Colonel's offer hung in the back of her mind. The training program, the chance to teach what she'd learned, the possibility of multiplying her impact, of passing forward the lessons that had kept her soldiers alive. She'd been resistant at first. Teaching meant leaving the field. It meant trading the adrenaline of combat for the slower rhythm of instruction. It meant accepting that her body, with its frostbitten fingers and missing toes, might never be field-ready again. But it also meant something else. It meant that the next time a medic found themselves in an impossible situation, blizzard closing in, casualties mounting, evacuation impossible, they would have more than just protocols to rely on. They would have the knowledge that someone had been there before, that survival was possible, that the impossible was just the untried. Sarah made her decision. The next morning, she walked into Colonel Harrison's office and accepted the assignment. The training program. She said, I want to build it. Teach it. Make sure no medic ever has to face what I face without knowing that there's another option. The Colonel smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, Staff Sergeant. Staff Sergeant. She was still getting used to the new rank. When do we start? As soon as you're ready. I'm ready now. The Advanced Combat Medic Training Program launched 8 months later, with Sergeant First Class Sarachin as its lead instructor and primary curriculum designer. The first class consisted of 12 medics, hand-selected from units across all branches, chosen for their technical skills and their psychological resilience. Sarah stood in front of them on day one, the same mountain that had almost killed her visible through the window behind her, and told them the truth. Everything you've learned up to this point, the protocols, the procedures, the step-by-step checklist, it's all useful. It's all important. But it's not enough. When you're in the field, when the mission is failing and casualties are mounting and help isn't coming, you're going to need something more. She paused, letting the silence stretch. You're going to need judgment, the ability to assess a situation and make decisions that no manual can prepare you for, the willingness to take risks that might save lives or might cost them, the strength to keep going when every instinct tells you to stop. And how do we learn that, Sergeant? One of the students, a Navy corpsman with hard eyes and a skeptical expression, leaned forward. By making decisions under pressure. By failing in training so you don't fail in combat. Sarah gestured toward the window, toward the mountains. We're going to put you in situations that feel impossible. You're going to face casualties you can't save. You're going to run out of supplies, lose communications, watch simulated patients die despite your best efforts. And then you're going to do it again and again until your instincts are sharper than any protocol, until your judgment is as reliable as your training. The program was brutal. Sarah designed it that way. 12-hour field exercises with no sleep. Mass casualty scenarios with too many patients and not enough resources. Forced decision-making under conditions of ambiguity and stress. Students failed. Some washed out, unable to handle the psychological pressure. Others transferred, seeking assignments that didn't require them to face their limits quite so directly. But the ones who stayed, they emerged transformed. Sarah watched them grow, watched them develop the judgment that no textbook could teach. She saw them make decisions under pressure, saw them keep working when everything went wrong, saw them refuse to give up on patients everyone else had written off. It was exhausting work. Some nights she lay awake, reviewing the day's exercises, wondering if she was pushing too hard or not hard enough. Other nights she dreamed of the blizzard, of Martinez's chest wound and Rodriguez's shattered leg, and the endless white void that had nearly swallowed them all. But she kept going, kept teaching, kept choosing forward momentum over surrender, because that was the lesson in the end, the one she'd learned on the mountain, the one she was trying to pass to every medic who came through her program. Survival wasn't about luck. It wasn't about equipment or training or protocol. It was about choice. The choice to keep going when everything said stop. The choice to fight when fighting seemed futile. The choice to believe that the impossible was just another obstacle to be overcome. Martinez, at home with his family, his lung capacity diminished but his spirit intact. Rodriguez, walking on prosthetic, enrolled in college courses, building a future he'd never imagined. Thompson, still serving, still walking, still carrying on. Jenkins, an officer now, leading soldiers of his own, passing forward the lessons he'd learned. These were the fruits of that single choice, the decision Sarah had made in the snow, to pick up her wounded and walk into the storm. Not because she knew she would succeed, not because the odds were in her favor, but because the alternative, waiting, hoping, surrendering to circumstance, was something she could not accept. 2 years after the program launched, Sarah received a letter. It was from one of her former students, a staff sergeant now, deployed to a remote outpost in a conflict zone she'd never been to. "You saved my life today," the letter said. "Not literally, I wasn't wounded, but my team was hit, and we had 3 critical casualties, and extraction was impossible, and I thought about giving up. I thought about waiting for help that wasn't coming. And then I remember what you taught us, that survival is a choice, that forward momentum beats surrender, that the impossible is just the untried. I carried my soldiers out, all 3 of them, 6 miles through hostile territory with no support, and they're alive because of what you taught me. Thank you, Sergeant Chun. Thank you for showing us what's possible." Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she put it in a lockbox with Maria Martinez's letter and all the other messages she'd received over the years from soldiers whose lives had been touched by what happened on that mountain. She thought about legacy, about what it meant to save a life, about the ripples that spread outward from every choice, every action, every decision to keep going when everything said stop. Martinez's children, growing up with their father, Rodriguez's future students, learning from a teacher who had refused to die, Thompson's comrades, still serving alongside a soldier who should have bled out in the snow, Jenkins' troops, led by an officer who knew that true leadership meant making impossible choices, and now her students, scattered across the world, carrying the lessons she'd taught them, saving lives she would never know about. The Mount others would keep saving lives long after she was gone. 5 years after the evacuation, Sarah returned to Afghanistan, not as a combat medic. Those days were behind her, but as an advisor, invited by the commanding general to evaluate the medical support systems across multiple forward operating bases. She arrived in November, the same month as the evacuation. The air was crisp, the mountains painted gold by the morning sun, and for a moment she was 19 again, standing on a different ridgeline, watching the clouds build over the peaks. The memories came back. They always did. Martinez bleeding out in the snow. Rodriguez screaming as the tourniquet tightened. The endless, impossible journey through the storm. But other memories came too. The warmth of the research station fire. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the silence. The faces of her soldiers, alive and recovering, their futures restored. Sergeant First Class Chun. She turned. A young lieutenant was approaching, tablet in hand, looking slightly nervous in the presence of someone whose reputation preceded her. "The general is ready for your briefing, whenever you are. Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. "Yes, ma'am." The lieutenant departed, and Sarah walked to the edge of the base, toward the view that had drawn her here in the first place. The Pancher Valley spread out before her. Even from this distance, she could identify the ridgeline where they'd been ambushed, the pass they crossed, the general direction of the research station. The geography hadn't changed. The mountains didn't care about human drama, but she had changed. The woman who had carried 3 dying soldiers through a blizzard was gone, replaced by someone who understood what that journey had meant. Not just for herself, but for everyone it had touched. Beautiful, isn't it? Sarah turned. An older woman had joined her at the edge of the base, silver-haired, weathered, with the bearing of someone who had seen more than her share of conflict. "I'm Dr. Patterson," the woman said, "Chief of Medical Operations for the region. I've heard a lot about you, Sergeant Chun. Good things, I hope. Legendary things." Patterson smiled. "The story of your evacuation has become something of a teaching case in our trauma medicine courses. The Chun Protocol, they call it, assessing when movement becomes survival rather than risk." Sarah laughed softly. I didn't know there was a protocol named after me. There is now. Your experience proves something we'd only theorized before, that in certain conditions, the traditional advice to shelter in place can be a death sentence. Your decision-making framework has saved lives. Many lives. I was just doing what needed to be done. That's what all the heroes say. Patterson's expression grew serious. But you should know what that doing has meant. We've tracked the outcomes. Soldiers who would have died under the old protocols, who survived because their medics remembered your story and made similar decisions. It's not just the 4 soldiers you carried. It's dozens more, maybe hundreds. Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She'd hoped her experience would help others. But she hadn't expected it to scale like this. The general wants to hear your assessment of our current systems, Patterson continued. But between you and me, I think what he really wants is for you to meet with the medics we got deployed here. Let them hear from you directly. Let them see that the person behind the story is real. I can do that. Good. Patterson turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. I noticed you looking at the valley, at the route you took. Sarah nodded. We evacuated the research station last year, packed up what was left, and moved it to a museum. But I thought you might want to know. They found something when they were cleaning out the radio room. What? A logbook. Someone had kept track of emergency transmissions through that station over the years. Soviet researchers, Western scientists, the occasional mountaineering expedition that got into trouble. Your transmission was the last entry. They'd framed it. Sergeant Chun, 75th Ranger Regiment. For casualties. The final rescue. Sarah felt something catch in her throat. The research station, which had saved her life and the lives of her soldiers, commemorated in a museum, their struggle preserved for history. Thank you for telling me, she managed. Thank you for being someone worth telling about. Patterson departed, and Sarah stood alone at the edge of the base, looking out at the mountains that forged her into who she was. She thought about what came next. The briefings, the assessments, the meetings with medics who would hang on her every word, the responsibility of living up to a legend she'd never asked to become. But she also thought about something simpler, about the morning sun on the peaks, about the crisp air filling her lungs, about the fundamental truth that had sustained her through everything. She was alive. Martinez, Rodriguez, Thompson, Jenkins, they were alive. And every life that had been saved because of her story, every medic who had made the impossible choice because they remembered what she'd done, they were evidence that suffering could have meaning, that sacrifice could ripple outward through time, that one decision, made in the worst moment of her life, could echo through history in ways she would never fully comprehend. The blizzard was 5 years behind her. The frostbite still sometimes ached in cold weather. The memory still sometimes woke her at night. But standing on that ridge, looking at the mountains that had almost killed her, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of moving on, but the peace of integration, of taking the worst thing that had ever happened to her and finding the gift hidden inside it, the gift of purpose, the gift of meaning, the gift of knowing exactly what she was capable of and exactly what she was supposed to do with that knowledge. Teach others, pass it forward. Multiply the commitment. That was her legacy, not the medals or the promotions or the protocols named after her. The legacy was the next generation of medics who would carry their soldiers through storms of their own, who would refuse to accept defeat, who would choose forward momentum over surrender. Sarah turned away from the mountains and walked toward the briefing room. She had work to do. The briefing lasted 3 hours. Sarah walked the assembled officers and medical personnel through every system, every protocol, every potential failure point she'd identified. She was thorough, precise, and uncompromising. The same standards she'd applied to herself now applied to the organization she served. When it was over, she met with the medics, 37 of them, gathered in a dusty tent that had been converted to a training facility, their faces marked by a particular combination of exhaustion and alertness that characterized soldiers in a combat zone. She told them her story. Not the legend, but the truth, the fear, the doubt, the moments when she wanted to stop and give up and let the mountain win. She told them about Martinez's chest wound and the needle decompression that had saved his life, about Rodriguez's leg and the impossible choice of saving the soldier while losing the limb, about Jenkins, 19 years old and terrified, carrying a stretcher through a blizzard because someone had to. And then she told him the lesson. Survival is a choice, she said. Not a single choice, 1,000 choices. Every step you take, every breath you draw, every time you check a pulse or adjust a bandage or decide whether to stay or move. Survival is choosing forward momentum over surrender, again and again, until you're either safe or dead. And when you fail, one of the younger medics, barely old enough to serve, raised his hand. When you make all the right choices and people still die, Sarah looked at him, looked at all of them. Then you live with it, she said. You carry it, you learn from it, and you get up the next day and you make more choices. Because that's the job. We don't save everyone. We save everyone we can. The tent was silent. 37 medics, processing what they'd heard, trying to reconcile the legend with the human being standing in front of them. I won't tell you it gets easier, Sarah continued. It doesn't. The weight of responsibility doesn't lighten with experience. It just becomes more familiar. But I will tell you this. Every soldier you save, every life you fight for, every impossible situation you refuse to accept, it matters. It matters more than you can possibly understand. She paused, gathering herself for what came next. Because the soldiers you save go home to families. They raise children. They build futures. And those children, those futures, they exist because you refuse to give up. You might never know their names. You might never see their faces. But they're out there, living lives that wouldn't exist without you. That's the job. That's the privilege. That's what you signed up for. She looked at them, young faces, old faces, faces marked by combat and faces still innocent of its horrors. Her students, in a way, the next generation. Any questions? There were questions, dozens of them, about techniques, about protocols, about the specific decisions she'd made on the mountain. She answered each one with the patience and precision of someone who understood that knowledge passed from person to person was the most valuable currency in the world. When it was over, they gathered around her, some to shake her hand, some to share their own stories, some simply to be in the presence of someone who represented what they aspired to become. One of them, a staff sergeant about Sarah's age, with the quiet confidence of a veteran, stayed behind after the others had left. Sergeant Chun, can I have a minute? Of course. My name's Rivera. I was in Kandahar 2 years ago. Convoy hit an IED, multiple casualties, no extraction available. I made the decision to move them. 7 miles. 2 didn't make it. His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the weight beneath the words. I've spent 2 years wondering if I made the right call, if I should have waited, if they died because I moved them. Sarah met his eyes. Did you have a choice? I thought so, at the time. And if you'd stayed? If you'd waited for extraction that wasn't coming? Rivera was silent. There are no right calls, Sarah said gently. Only calls. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and you live with the results. 2 of your soldiers died. How many lived? 5. 5 soldiers who went home because of your decision, because you chose to act instead of wait. That's not failure. Rivera, that's leadership. It doesn't feel like leadership. It feels like I failed the 2 who died. It will always feel like that. That's the weight we carry. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. But you need to remember the 5. You need to hold on to them when the 2 start pulling you under. Because drowning in what you couldn't save means you can't save the next one. And there's always a next one. Rivera nodded slowly. Thank you, Sergeant. Thank me by staying in the fight. Your soldiers need you. I will. He left, and Sarah stood alone in the empty tent. Dust motes floating in the light that filtered to the canvas. 5 years since the mountain. 5 years of healing, and teaching and learning to carry the weight. She thought about Martinez, home with his family, his lung capacity diminished, but his life full. She thought about Rodriguez, walking on his prosthetic, teaching now, passing forward his own lessons. She thought about Thompson, still serving, still walking, proof that some wounds heal completely. She thought about Jenkins, an officer now, leading soldiers with the wisdom of someone who had seen the worst and come out the other side. And she thought about the medics she'd trained over the years, the students who'd become instructors, the lives saved because one woman had refused to accept death in a blizzard. The legacy rippled outward, touching people she would never meet, changing outcomes she would never know about. This was what it meant to serve, not the medals or the ceremonies or the promotions, the impact, the multiplication, the endless chain of choices extending into the future, each one built on the foundation she laid. Sarah walked out of the tent and into the Afghan sunlight. The mountains rose around her, indifferent and eternal. She had come back to assess systems and protocols, but she had found something more. She had found closure, not the closure of forgetting she would never forget, but the closure of integration, the peace of knowing that the worst moment of her life had become the foundation for something larger than herself. The blizzard had almost killed her. Instead, it had shown her who she was. A medic, a teacher, a leader, someone who chose forward momentum over surrender again and again until the impossible became real. The sun was setting over the peaks, painting them gold and crimson, and Sarah Chun stood watching, at peace with the mountains that had made her. Tomorrow, she would fly home. She would return to her training program, her students, the endless work of preparing others for the moments that would define them. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be present, to feel the cool air on her skin, to watch the shadows lengthen across the valley where she had carried her soldiers out of the darkness. 12 hours, 8 miles, 3 critical casualties, and a legacy that would echo through generations. The choice had been hers. The consequences belonged to the world. If this story kept you engaged, hit that like button. Tell me in the comments, would you have made the same decision Sarah made, defying orders to save lives, knowing it could cost your career or your life? Subscribe if you haven't already. More stories like this are coming. See you in the next one.